Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO. Today I got a fun, interesting, and unfortunately disappointing video for you guys this evening, because we're going to be talking about the recent Video Game History Foundation appeal to the US Copyright Office in regards to the preservation, research, and history of video games. And unfortunately, like pretty much every other decision or result recently, it ends up going to the rights holders 100%, and video game historians, fans, and researchers are left holding a very empty bag. And this was basically their appeal to the US government, saying that the preservation, research, and sharing of games needed to be corrected, and people should be able to access them online for legitimate research purposes so that they can actually do this foundational work. It has to do with reverse engineering and circumvention, something we've been talking about on the channel a lot, including the DMCA. That's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. We're not talking about DMA strikes, we're talking about the actual law in and of itself. Because just last week on October 25th, the ruling came down from the US Copyright Office in regard to the Video Game History Foundation's request to change the ruling on this, because right now digital lending libraries can lend out books, they can lend out other information. You can go online to a library, to Internet Archive or otherwise, and be able to actually access this information. So they were looking for a new exemption in support of video game preservation, and of course they didn't end up getting this whatsoever. They got absolutely nothing. It would have allowed for a new exemption to the DMCA in support of video game preservation, and it would have allowed for some ability to circumvent game protections so that they could actually share this with you. And we're not talking about Nintendo Switch games, we're talking about some of the rarest of the rarest stuff. And if you don't know me or my channel, you know I'm always advocating for the preservations of exceedingly rare games. Something like Akuma Mortis Immortum that I was able to share with people is a defunct, non-released arcade game that seemed to have maybe 3 to 4 arcade cabinets, prototypes indeed, in the entirety of the world. Nobody could play this game whatsoever unless you're one of 3 basic collectors, but I was able to, with the help of my Discord, preserve this game, make it playable so that anyone in the world, anytime they wanted, could play and experience a game that never released, had no rights holder, and was basically lost to time. It was 100% just lost media, and that's a lot of what the Video Game History Foundation is talking about here. They're not talking about giving you a way to go ahead and play Super Mario World from your browser. There's tons of ways to already do that. They were talking about preserving the history of the medium and being able to allow researchers to go in, experience the games, and foundationally write or otherwise talk about that topic. Whether they're instructors in game design school, whether they're video game historians or otherwise, they'd be able to, if this exemption had gone through, access these games online to be able to actually research them. But of course, the US Copyright Office decided, no way in hell, you're not going to get that whatsoever. While that's disappointing for sure, it's ultimately not very surprising whatsoever, and they've been working on this for the last 3 years along with the Software Preservation Network, just to allow libraries and archives to remotely share those out-of-print video games for researchers. This is not an online library of video games that anyone can access. This is not an online arcade where you can play every single Super Nintendo game ever made. That obviously already exists in some way or another, and they wanted to deal with the Section 1201 of the DMCA in regards to circumvention, which is exactly what we've been talking about a lot with Nintendo Switch emulation, and Nintendo going after Yuzu and other emulator makers, talking about the fact that they do not think that actually circumventing this protection is allowed under the DMCA. And the DMCA does allow for a lot of exemptions on circumvention, including research and interoperability of actual software to the hardware. So really it isn't decided whether or not emulator makers are or are not doing something wrong when they are able to circumvent this technology. We just don't really know yet, because there isn't a court case that's decided it whatsoever. And for everything the DMCA bans, they also seem to allow the exact same thing in the next paragraphs. They just use language that basically allows for some exemptions, but they are a little bit vague and are not easy to understand. And that's what the Video Game Preservation Foundation was actually trying to get here. They were trying to get a new exemption to allow for the sharing and circumvention of some protections so that they could have online access for researchers to go in and actually study this. Unfortunately, that again did not get decided whatsoever, and that's because the rights holders and the rights holders publishing groups are very, very malicious, and they do not want this to happen whatsoever. We'll go over that a little bit later in the video, but some of their statements are absolutely downright hilarious in some way, shape, or form. And this is after they did a study talking about the fact that 87% of classic video games are just completely out of print and quote-unquote gone. Now we do need to parse that through. Just because they're not available on the market doesn't mean you can't find them and find some way to play them. You can buy original copies, you can use emulation, things such as that, but 87% of the industry basically hasn't been preserved. And to say video games are a huge industry would be an understatement. They're every bit as big as film and television these days, and in some instances can even do more revenue. And that's just the reality situation. Right now, pretty much every other artistic medium is preserved and you're able to experience it from the comfort of your own home so long as you have the proper credentials. But as far as video games, then the artistic medium of video games, and I do believe it is an art form in some instances, you just don't have that protection and ability whatsoever. There's entire decades of research into video games. There's thousands upon thousands of games that have been out there in the 80s and 90s that you forgot about or didn't even know exist that really are at risk of being completely lost and going extinct forever. And that's why groups like the Video Game History Foundation are fundamentally important to this hobby. They are a very real museum and a very real research group. These are not the type of people that send you emails that have a quote-unquote museum, and when you actually look up the address, it is just someone's garage. And trust me, I've got enough rare hardware. I get contacted all the time asking for donations, and I would say 9 out of 10 of them are completely made up imaginary groups. This is not. And while there are a ton of ways to preserve games as well as the hardware, and we're going to see that change in the future to include even more awesome abilities, it is still disappointing because researchers out there aren't just going to grab a Mr. FPGA, and there is research done in the history of video games all the time. This is a medium that is always growing and has been with us basically since the late 70s, and like any other artistic medium, film, television, books, magazines, and such, it should be preserved and be available for research. And again, I am not advocating for something where you can just go online, click a button and play a game just because you feel like doing it in your own home. We already have stuff like that, and honestly, software emulation has preserved so many experiences. A project like MAME alone has basically kept the arcade industry alive as far as the games they have made. So many arcade cabinets did not succeed, so many have been recycled and are impossible to find these days. It's only via emulation, and being able to actually preserve these games are some of them even experienceable anymore. Sure, something like California Speeds may be easy to find, but other games are not. Or even stuff like Big PMU, the Atari Jaguar emulator, which is released and amazing. It allows people to experience the Atari Jaguar where maybe the only other way to do it would be to go out and buy a $500 console and a copy of the game. This preservation is important. If some film researcher wants to research the history of something like Alien vs. Predator, they're probably going to end up on Big PMU if they want to play all of the games. And of course, every single trade group opposed the entirety of this exemption request. They wanted nothing to do with it. They said that it was not fair, that it would cause market harm, and that there was no instance in which this should be permittable because they didn't think it was necessary in any way, shape, or form. And I can tell you, this is not the trade groups thinking that preservation isn't important. It's them thinking that maybe there might be a dollar to be made 10 years down the line, and they don't want to risk that dollar. It's basically just saying, no, we won't allow it, just in case in the future we might want to make some money off of this, even though 99% chance that we're probably not going to touch it whatsoever. But that's how the world works. Money makes the globe turn, and they think there's some money in the future, so they want nothing to do with it. Unfortunately, the register did say that they're not changing anything, the single user limitation, any of the circumvention. They just basically told video game preservationists and video game historians to go pound sand. And that is a bummer because these things don't get decided every single day. It is a process. You need to get this in front of the board for review, and it does take some time to go over it, but it really isn't surprising, unfortunately, because in a quote from the legal representative of the ESA, they said, "I don't think there is any moment or any combination of limitations that ESA members would support to provide remote access." Basically what they're saying is it doesn't matter if you try to work with them, it doesn't matter if you try to allay their fears, they don't give a damn, they just want to say no, they want you to have nothing, and that's just how it works. And this will end up meaning that some games just do completely get lost to time, because these large research and preservation groups really do protect gaming history, because for every Akuma there's 100 Akumas out there that you don't know about that somebody at one of these institutions is preserving. But then one day if you actually want to experience it or research it, you're just not going to be able to do so whatsoever because they do not want you to let you. And that is just such a bummer. It seems like every single time video game preservation is brought up, it's in a negative way. They think that it's just basically stealing their revenue, but we're talking about games that absolutely have no revenue streams, and never will. But that's the reality of this situation. Again, I hate making these videos because I wish something would go the way of video game fans and video game preservationists, but it just never seems to do so. But if you have any questions or comments, I'll leave them down below. Tell me your thoughts, and I will see you guys next time. Hope you enjoyed the video, and hope next time it's a little bit more positive. Bye-bye.